Thank you so much for this invitation. It's a great pleasure to be included in this event. And I want to start by apologising that having spent most of my life on the other side of the planet, I've lost any tiny capacity I might have had previously to deliver this lecture in your own more beautiful language. But please trust me when I tell you this would be even more painful for you than it would be for me. Now I'm going to talk to you today about mythological water serpent beings. This may seem like quite an esoteric topic, but they're remarkably useful creatures because they give us very important insights into how past societies have thought about water and how it flows and how it connects earthly and celestial realms. And they also find us ways to think about how contemporary societies imagine and might reimagine those relationships. Now I should probably start by defining what I mean by water beings, because there are many thousands of mythological creatures and deities associated with water. Both culturally and historically, they're hugely diverse. And I'm going to focus in particular on water serpent beings. And I want to be clear that this includes dragons. Now, if I was giving this lecture in Beijing or Saigon, this would not come as a surprise at all. But for those of us in Europe, we've tended to have lost the idea a little bit, that because we've focused on dragons fire-breathing and so forth, that the links between dragons and water have become a little lost in the mists of time. Although when you see images of them, such as from the pueblos in southern parts of the state, spitting lightning, and this is from near Santa Fe, remind us that even lightning and fire breathing, of course, relates to storms and to water. And when you go to the Far East, of course, you find in places like Vietnam that the dragons are quite literally depicted spewing out water. So this makes the association very clear. Now, one of the most interesting things about these beings is that societies have generated them with most extraordinary ubiquity. They appear in just about every cultural and historical tradition. So I'm going to take you through a few of them just to give you a sense of their character, because they appear even in the earliest human records in rock art. Here's a little one from Australia and another one from the southern parts of the States. And even in rock art in Malawi, we get these wonderful rainbow serpent beings of the Batwa hunter-gatherers who were the first inhabitants of that region. And while we are in Africa, here's a rather lovely serpent being from Guinea-Bissau with antelope horns. If we go up to America's northwest coast, we find the dual-headed Sisutul, which is venerated by Kwakiutl and related groups. And if we go to Oceania, we find this is a Maori Marikihau, which is a sea being, a taniwha, which guard the rivers. So when we look at a collection of these beings, they have a great deal, they have like a family resemblance in common. Most of them are snake-like and serpentine, and they resonate with the snake, the most water-like of animals, which is often associated with regeneration. Many adopt the colours of local water, turquoise and blue or brown, and they're often described as being shining and glittering like water. They appear coming out of clouds and waves and water around them. And they're hybrid in their form, in that they integrate not only water itself, but they're composed of all the local life forms that they generate. So this is why we get antelope beings in Africa, and bears and wolves in Canada, and crocodiles in Australia, because they're basically hybrid forms. And that you probably noticed that the jaws are quite important in some of them. This is a reference to the swallowing and consuming nature of water, as well as the notion of spitting out and making and creating. And of course they are always serpentine and winding in shape like the waterways. So they convey very important ideas about animation and flow and movement. So the fact that so many water beings from so many different times and places tells us something very interesting about cognitive processes and how humans think not only about the world, but with the world. So when they imagine deities that encapsulate the powers of water, they employ the formal properties of water to imagine them, the serpentine fluidities, the colour, the reflections, and the very dualistic, beneficial and dangerous powers, the capacities to swallow and consume things. So what we have, in fact, are beings that personify or manifest the generative powers of water. And it's very logical, therefore, that they have two major roles. One is that they appear very frequently in origin stories about the genesis of the world. So the most recurrent image in stories of cosmogenesis is the emergence of form and material from a primal sea of chaos from which life emerges. And of course, archaeological research gives us some nice insights into pre-literate societies. So probably the first written accounts of Genesis, which might be more familiar, arise from Neolithic ideas. One of the earliest written records, for example, is the Enuma Elish, the creation epic of the Babylonians, which flourished between 1750 BC and 539 BC. And then you get the cuneiform tablets from Nineveh, and they describe how at the beginning two elemental forces existed, a male spirit of fresh water and Tiamat, a dragon-like spirit of salt water, who was associated with primeval chaos. And that actually exerted a great deal of influence on the stories that followed about primeval waters, which come into more recent religious ideas. So for ancient society, water was very readily recognized as the most fundamental substance of life, basis for material existence. And this notion of a primal sea that generates the world is extremely widespread. You get Mayan creation stories describing the material world emerging from a lake sea. In China, the world making dragons emerge from both celestial and earthly water bodies. Across Polynesia, this is a Maori Taniwha, creation emerges from chaos, te kore, with the separation of light and darkness. And Wade Davis gives us a very colourful description in The Serpent's Role in the African religions that preceded Christianity in Haiti. He says, in the beginning, there was only the great serpent whose 7,000 coils lay beneath the sea, holding it in place that it might not fall into the abysmal sea. In time, the serpent began to move, unleashing its undulating flesh, which rose slowly into a great spiral that enveloped the universe. In the heavens, it released stars and all the celestial bodies. On earth, it brought forth creation. So, in Australia, for example, the rainbow serpent spews out all of the living kinds in the dream time, out of a formless, non-material dimension, and all the ancestral beings who then come out and form the landscape emerge. So that's the first, most basic role of water serpent beings, is to emerge, to rise up out of creative chaos and bring the world into being. And their bodies often become the continents of the world. They produce living beings. And this brings us, of course, to their other major function, which is to generate life and living kinds into the world and to provide the water that maintains this on a cyclical basis. So I want to talk a little bit about hydrotheological cycles because, for example, in Australia, as well as forming the land and waterscape and generating the ancestral beings in the dream time, the rainbow is still held within the ancestral waters of the land, the invisible world beneath, and it generates the human spirit. The spirit is said to jump up out of a water place to inhabit the fetus in a woman's womb, to be incarnated, to become material, and then it must be sung back to that home place when the person dies. And this is also refers to the notion of the water, the rainbow serpent, as a cycle of becoming material, becoming conscious, and then going back into being non-material, and the loss of consciousness, and the law, as Aboriginal people call the knowledge, and so forth. And the rainbow serpent generates not only human beings, but all resources, all living kinds, plants and animals. And these are essential to human survival. And the communities, therefore, maintain a very respectful relationship with this very powerful, authoritative water being. And it remains sentient. This is a sentient cultural landscape that is always watching and listening and nurturing and, if necessary, punishing. Now, these cosmic and seasonal functions of the water serpent are also very nicely expressed in the beliefs of the Disana in Amazonia. And according to their creation myth, the great anaconda that once contained humankind is called a fermentation placenta, which gives you a really basic idea of it as a fertility object. And it's fertilized by interaction between celestial and earthly beings. And so, in effect, what it does is to ensure cycles of production and reproduction, and also to arrange the stars and the oceans and set the seasons into sequence. So nearly everything of consequence in Disana life follows celestial cycles, the weather, the growth of plants, the availability of fish, the abundance of game. This is very typical of hunter-gatherer communities, that seasonal cycles are based on what actually happens at each time of the year. So they're very interested in what the universe does as well as what it looks like. And typically Amazonian tribes have twin serpent beings, and this is very common in early cultures where you get a sort of gender complementarity between nature beings. And here's another one of those. This is an Aztec Coatl, and the term coatl means serpent or twin, and its function, as in Amazonia, is to link earthly and celestial waters, enabling sky deities to fertilize the earth. And ideas about water in the celestial realm are also expressed through the categorization of different constellations as dragons and serpent beings. So across time and across cultures we see numerous representations of serpents in constellations in the sky, and as or Scorpio or Draco as it's commonly described. In Arawak astronomy, for example, another South American tribe, it's described as a celestial boa, and it has a very important role in mediating identities and exchange relationships in Arawak society. So it creates what anthropologists described as moieties, two halves of a society to exchange people and goods, and Jara explains to us the boa, identified as Scorpius, has a peculiar relationship with the Pleiades, since they're setting and rising at the opposite hours of dawn and dusk, can be used to represent opposite and complementary relationships in social exchange. So what I hope that gives you an idea of is that the water serpent being is often a figure of enormous authority. It's believed to impart wisdom, it creates social and political order, and it's also about managing resources sustainably for future generations. So one of the major roles of Arawak celestial water serpent beings is to coordinate annual horticultural activities with the major wet and dry seasons, signalling, for example, when it's time to cut down the first trees and open the planting cycle. So effectively, Jara says, Scorpius bears the name of the water boa and announces the December rains, and at the end of the season, according to the Waspigian group, it swallows the red macaw, which represents Antares. And then for the Piakur, Antares appears as an agouti in the belly of the snake. So we get some very nice ideas about how the rain and the seasons swallow and regurgitate sorts of things. And also you often get this as a sort of daily cycle of swallowing the sun and so forth into the sea. So that brings us to another key role of water serpent beings, which is to articulate society's understandings of how water flows through the world, all the hydrological flows, and its movements between the earth and the sky. So it's not at all surprising to find that there are very many rainbow serpent beings, particularly in Australia and Africa, but actually all over the place. This multicoloured art that people very readily see as a connective creature. So here's a rather nice dragon from a summer palace in Beijing, and it highlights quite an important connection, because the Chinese for dragon is luo, although I doubt I'm pronouncing that correctly. But it also means arch or bow, and this is a direct reference to the rainbow, which is indicated by the arch in its back, and which is very typical of dragons in this part of the world. And as you can see, and you'll be familiar with these sorts of images, dragons in China are almost invariably shown connecting clouds and waves and swallowing the pearl moon or playing with the pearl moon and so forth. So they're very clearly about the relationships between different spheres. And it's also very common, here's a nice one from Vietnam, to find dragons that are specifically described as ascending or descending. And this underlines their meanings as manifestations of ideas about the hydrological movements of water. So the very famous Halong Bay there is actually, Long of course refers to the dragon, and it literally means descending dragon. And of course, as well as describing the movement of water hydrologically, many water beings interact with celestial bodies, as is with the Arawaks, for example. So they announce seasonal cycles. They often have relationships with the moon, and the moon in Asia is very much associated with water and with femininity, while the sun provides the sort of gender complementarity that is common amongst nature beings, and that's not an unusual idea. And as I mentioned, in some cases, the diurnal movements of the sun are explained in conjunction with the swallowing and consuming capacities of water. So if we look at a nice Egyptian example, the god Apep, or Apophis, the great devourer serpent, resides in the celestial Nile, Milky Way, whose role it is to swallow and regurgitate the sun god Ra on a daily basis. So the serpent actually swallows the sun god at sunset. He must travel through the underworld of water to rise again in his canoe or bark in the morning. And it's so very nicely described in ideas about sky rivers. So in China, for example, we find descriptions of Tianhe, the silvery way, in which stars are seen to reflect a celestial waterway. And here's a lovely dot painting from Central Australia, and it describes the Milky Way with the seven sisters, ancestral beings, dotted along it. And the Greeks, similarly, envisioned Okeanos, a sort of swirling river of water around the earth. And that notion of water encircling the earth is also present in a very widely used image of the Ouroboros, which, like water, has been used in Egyptian iconography, Greek magical traditions, and also by the Gnostics to represent the eternal flow of time. So water serpent beings represent how people have imagined hydrological flows, but they've also thought about how water changes form and becomes air in the process of moving between earth and sky. So they understand the notion of transformation and time. So this is a very lovely cloud dragon from a 12th century Zen temple in Kyoto. And I like this one particularly because you can see the dragon is quite literally becoming out of the clouds. And this underlines a reality that these beings are literally composed of water in all of its forms. And of course, this is also part of the world that you get ideas about hidden dragons, which, as well as ascending and descending, move between more material and non-material forms. So people sometimes express the notion of water and air relationships by giving water serpent beings feathers or wings. So this is a very famous example of a powerful serpent at Chichen Itza in the Mexican Yucatan, which is said to writhe when the solstice hits it in a particular way. And this dates back to between 600 BCE and 1200 CE. And this serpent, Kukulkan, is still a very major part of the Mayan calendar, and it's a version of the Aztec feathered serpent, Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent, which is supposedly covered in the wonderful green feathers of the Quetzal bird. But this, of course, references its relationship to air and an atmosphere. And you often get wings on serpents. Here's one from the northern parts of the States in Moundville. And of course, you'll be very familiar, I'm sure, with the Welsh dragon and the fact that dragons in Europe are almost invariably represented as being winged creatures, and I'll come back to them in a moment. So in essence, water serpent beings draw together a whole set of ideas about how water changes form, evaporating into an invisible state, disappearing into the atmosphere and reappearing out of it. And so even the earliest human societies had very keen awareness of the properties of water. And then they used those ideas to conceptualize ideas about life and the flow of time and how the human spirit itself might move between material and non-material form, how it might shift between hidden underworlds and far-off heavens. So as we see with the Australian rainbow serpent here, it's often the function of water serpent beings to carry not just water but human spiritual being between earthly and celestial domains and to link underworlds and heavens. So water serpent beings are doing an awful lot of imaginative work as well as describing just the material properties and behaviours of water. They provide us with ideas about the origins of the world, seasonal cycles, the human spirit. They govern social behaviour and economic practices, and they can be both beneficent and punitive. They can respond to social and moral transgressions by withholding vital rains or bringing floods. And so what I want to underline there is that water serpents were, and still are in some places, very powerful and authoritative beings. They're the focus of rituals that valorize and propitiate them. They get libations, they get votive offerings. In this part of the world, the Celts made votive offerings into holy wells, for example. Rain dances, such as this one from the Pueblos, are designed to maintain a respectful and collaborative relationship with them, and through them with the local environment. So as manifestations of water and its powers, water serpent beings do two very important things. They locate humankind within the world and its flows and processes. And they make a very clear statement that humankind is not separate from or above nature, but held within this living, sentient world, working with it and not merely acting on it. And they present a very clear vision of a particular kind of relationship with the non-human world. The rituals engaging with them express reciprocal human, non-human partnerships, very cognitive of the agentive capacities of non-human entities and respectful of their needs and interests. And that's really the point of my focus on them. Water serpent beings provide an alternative model of human, non-human relations. They envisage a more egalitarian way of engaging with mutually beneficial partnerships, and in which human responsibilities are to care for the material environment and its non-human inhabitants. And then the deal is they are rewarded with social and ecological stability. So for an awful lot of our human history, this collaborative approach was demonstrably a very good recipe for maintaining human environmental relationships. So the question then becomes, how can we carry these kinds of ideas and values into contemporary relationships with water? So as well as illuminating how water is envisaged in celestial realms, they have another important story to tell. How societies such as our own has embarked upon a very different kind of relationship with development. What happened to societies' relationships with the non-human world as they gained more technological capacity, for example, to direct water's flows? If we look at what happens to water serpent beings over time, we can see some very critical changes in human environmental relationships in terms of the big picture trajectories. And this is what has led us to the current ecological crisis. So with the caveat that this can only be a very tiny, crude and reductive sketch of a very large and complex story, this is how I think it goes. Worshipping and propitiating water beings was, and in some contexts still is, clearly a strong foundation for treating human and non-human beings with respect. So it's quite useful to draw attention to how changes in religious beliefs, which as Durkheim observed, go hand in hand with social and political changes. As he put it, human societies create their gods in their own images, so that religious arrangements are basically a mirror of how societies are arranged in themselves. So as societies enlarged and became more hierarchical and more patriarchal, so of course do their deities. Now my own hypothesis, to add to Durkheim, which underpins the forthcoming text on this topic, is that we also need to factor into this the growing technical instrumentality that helps to drive those kinds of social and political changes. So we have to think about that as a third factor. So we recognise the political and religious relationships, but we also need to think about the relationships between that and technological arrangements. So what happens historically to water beings in that when societies develop more instrumentality, for example when they shift into agricultural economies. Now as long as those changes were low-key, not very much. Societies who made forest gardens or low-key horticulture continue to valorise their water serpent beings, and as with the Arawak horticulturalists, they simply placed a stronger emphasis on their ability to bring annual rain for crops. And you see their forms changing accordingly. So this is a little horned serpent from the southern parts of the States, and if you look carefully, easy if I point it to you, this is actually a collar representing a maize crop, and it signifies the importance of the serpent being in generating the annual rains necessary for a successful crop. And this is accompanied by changes in ritual practices, focusing on dances, requesting rain at that particular time. And water serpent beings also don't have too many problems when people use flood irrigation historically. So societies making low bunds to capture the Nile or the great eastern rivers continue to valorize their serpent beings and rely on them to bring the vital annual flood. But when we see the emergence of more intensive agricultural technologies and the enclosure of land into farms and the more direct domestication of plants and animals, something very interesting happens. So we find that this representations of water beings begin to change. As societies acquire more material control over their environments and presumably feel more powerful, they begin to euhemerize their water beings, that is, they humanize them. So we see in their pantheons of deities the emergence of semi-humanized beings, such as these Roman and Greek water deities. It's possible to chart these transformations over time. There's a very typical Makara, a double-headed serpent being, which you see right across India and the Far East. And the early renditions of these beings were very plant and water creature-like, and basically animal. And they combine things like lotus imagery and so forth. And that's very visible in the images that recur across Asia. But in later Hinduism and Buddhism, we see more humanized deities, such as these Nagas. This is a very well-known water being, the Naga, with its human body and serpentine form. And you get goddesses such as the Rajagaru, who first appears right back in the Indus Valley and was clearly plant and animal in form at the beginning, gaining human bodies, and eventually the serpent beings are relegated to become just vehicles for humanized deities, such as the goddess Ganga. And gods start to shift between human and serpentine form, and the great cosmic serpents, such as Ananta or many other names, are required to carry the Buddha or Krishna and his consort. And particularly in areas where urbanization takes hold and societies begin to embark on early science, you get religious narratives and images describing former serpent beings, such as Zeus, who originally is recorded as being the kindly serpent, transitioning into a patriarchal, bearded man. So very fully humanized over time. And then as these societies become more hierarchical and patriarchal, they intensify their instrumental activities. They start building aqueducts and directing water in very, very controlling ways. And you get this bifurcation of ideas between nature and culture, and a gendering in which nature is recast as sort of unruly, feminized chaos, which has to be made obediently reproductive. And this requires not only sort of virtuous, maidenly, female humanized gods, it also requires the monotheisms of their belief in a fully humanized single male god with absolute dominion. But of course, the successful transition to monotheisms requires the very aggressive suppression of the preceding nature religions. It took a long time. It took a long time because people were pretty attached to worshipping nature beings, and a lot of those with Christianity forced upon them just carried on doing their thing covertly and sort of wrapped Christianity over it. But you get a lot of pressure, particularly in this part of the world, to suppress paganism and what became known as heresy, and particularly religions that worshipped goddesses. I mean, really, imagine. So what you get in the medieval period is a kind of fluorescence of serpent slaying, dragon slaying. They was just like everywhere. Male culture hero figures stabbing away at heretics or stabbing away at dragons, but it's basically the same activity of imposing a notion of patriarchal dominion onto religions that were resistant to conversion. And so with that, and this notion of separation of nature and culture, it's basically about the appropriation of the powers of nature. So male culture is no longer a manifestation of local environmental powers, but this abstract administrative figure located in a far-off heaven. And that's the other thing that happens. The gods move further and further away. They come out of the local trees and springs. They go up to places like Valhalla, Olympus, and then they go up into further heavens because they become much more abstract, larger sort of idea. And tellingly, these figures appropriate all of the powers of bringing the rain and if necessary, punishing with floods and droughts that the earlier water serpent beings have. So they have all the capacities of inflicting these things and of generating life. So all the powers that the water serpent beings have pass to these figures. And this requires this very aggressive suppression. So there's a little pattern which is recurrent across societies and across time in a very reliable sort of way. And it's a tiny sketch of a very obviously vast and complex story, but it's very revealing. It reveals a movement accompanied by political, religious, and technological change from positioning humankind in an actively reciprocal and egalitarian partnership with the non-human worlds and other living kinds into a more alienated relationship in which the goal is to achieve instrumental dominion over these things and to direct the world to meet human needs and interests. Now, as we all know very well, this development trajectory doesn't really lead to a happy ending, because assisted by more and more sophisticated technologies and infrastructure, this shift to exerting dominion has encouraged the kinds of short-termist, exploitative practices that have led us to the current ecological crisis and the anthropogenically caused mass extinction of other species. And what lies at the heart of this problem is that prioritising human interests and instrumentalising the environment to provide ecosystem services is led to widening inequality between human and non-human beings. And over again, along with less powerful human groups, the needs and interests of non-human beings are being almost entirely overridden by what Rogers and O'Neill describe as infrastructural violence. And by this, they mean the imposition of intensive instrumental technologies, the big dams, the channels, that redirect natural ecosystem flows into irrigating crops and producing hydroelectricity and supporting industry and providing water for ever-expanding human populations. And a classic example is provided by Cubby Station, which is a great irrigation property just above the New South Wales border in Queensland, where the owners, which is a consortia, have been allowed to buy up over 50 water licenses and redirect in this channel about a quarter of the water that would otherwise flow into the Darling River and therefore into the Murray-Darling Basin, which, as I'm sure you'll be aware, is one of the most compromised river basins on the planet. And this is a pattern repeated everywhere in the world in river catchment areas, but it hasn't happened without opposition. So I'm going to turn now to talking about the pushback on these things. There are some very vocal counter-movements protesting against both social and ecological injustice. So we have environmental groups, conservation groups, feminist groups, indigenous networks, sharing a broadly common goal to seek more collaborative relationships, to provide alternative ways to think about these things, and to make sure that there are better relationships between human and non-human worlds. So we get some very important indigenous networks, for example, around two key issues. One, the reclaiming of land and water so that it can be cared for properly, and all the land that was lost during colonial appropriations, and also a critique of industrial society's more exploitative practices. And people have used a variety of means to communicate their views. You probably remember the films produced by the Kogi in South America in the 90s, warning younger brother, that's us, about the need to generate greater wisdom in engaging with the non-human world. More recently, a lot of coverage has gone to the Dakota Sioux and the Standing Rock issue, working with environmental and social justice groups to organise a big protest against an oil pipeline, which they know will have a major impact on their land and water. And then, of course, we have the emergence of Extinction Rebellion, lively and urgent efforts to, particularly by youth movements, to stress the urgency of making real changes changes in current practices. So how might such changes be achieved? How might we regain a more egalitarian, reciprocal, and more sustainable relationship with the non-human world? And I think this requires three key things. First and foremost, we have to achieve a transformation in how we think about human, non-human relations. We have to start from a less anthropocentric perspective, one that gives real consideration to non-human rights and interests, as Anna referred to. Secondly, we have to carry that alternate way of thinking into governance and practice at every scale and into regulations and legislation. And we need to be inventive in developing new practices to engage with the non-human world so that the rights and interests of other living kinds are not continually overridden. So the interesting question is, how do we reimagine a less anthropocentric relationship with the other species on the planet? We can't, although I'm sure it'd be lovely to try, we can't just reinvent cosmological ideas about water serpent beings, although I do think it would be an interesting exercise. But we can listen to the cultural groups who still think about things in that kind of ways and think about how to recreate the sort of partnerships that those ideas express. And we're very fortunate, there's a very rich body of literature emerging from philosophy and anthropology and other disciplines, a very lively theoretical debate that seeks to challenge the intellectually flawed dualism of culture-nature divides and to relocate us within the biosphere, within the living world. And through these new ways of thinking, it is possible to imagine a more holistic, collaborative view. An important part of this debate has been the ideas about promoting non-human rights in the legal arena. So I just want to run through that quickly, because there have been some really interesting efforts to establish substantive legal rights for nature. So for example, in response to pressure from its indigenous communities, the government of Ecuador passed legislation in 2008 securing the rights of nature as part of its constitution, Pachamama. Bolivia followed suit a few years later with a law for Mother Earth. And as illustrated by the Standing Rock debate, indigenous communities in America have continued to apply these kinds of pressures based on their own beliefs and values. At an international level, we have organisations such as the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, campaigning for the UN to actually issue a declaration, as it did, to uphold human rights via ecological justice. And in the same way, trying to maintain that kind of equivalence to social justice. There's been the Earth Law Center promoted. It's based in New York and San Francisco, but it's linked with a number of NGOs internationally. And the Earth Law Center aspires to be a global force of advocates for the rights of nature. And here's how they put it. Just as people have fundamental rights, so too should nature. Earth law is the idea that ecosystems have the right to exist, to thrive and evolve, and that nature should be able to defend its rights in court. Earth law looks at the pressures on the earth that contribute to the destruction of ecosystem species, and it argues that a balanced approach can provide for the entire earth community, including humans. We envision a future in which humans and nature flourish together. So that's an interesting group. And a not dissimilar point is made by legal activists such as Polly Higgins to persuade the International Court of Criminal Justice to declare ecocide an international crime. And as she puts it, ecocide is loss or damage to or destruction of ecosystems of given territories such that peaceful enjoyment by the inhabitants has been or will be severely diminished. It's a crime against the living natural world. Ecocide is a crime against the earth, not just humans. It can be a climate crime. Dangerous industrial activity causes climate ecocide, and currently there is a missing responsibility to protect. So thinking about and establishing more reciprocal partnerships with the environment requires us to question underlying assumptions that growth and development are intrinsically good, are intrinsically linked, and that all is needed is a technological fix to put it right, higher levels of instrumental control. And interestingly, international and intergovernmental organisations are recognising that need for a shift in values. Over the last couple of years, for example, I've been working with the UN's high-level panel for water to assist them in writing some new principles for water that underpin its existing sustainability goals. And these promote the notion of greater diversity of values and the inclusion of alternative perspectives. So interestingly, although the UN's a very hard, it's slow and cumbersome, but its latest water report promotes the notion of nature-based solutions. So it's all still in managerial and technological language, but the idea of working with rather than on nature is present in that kind of idea. I could say a lot more about that, but I think I need to wrap up at this point. So what does this mean in terms of ideas about gardening the sky? Well, of course, you'll all know very well that for some people, this is just an opportunity to extend instrumentality upwards into celestial realms. So just as some seem travel to other planets solely in terms of the capacities to exploit their minerals, there's an obvious danger that, like so much of the instrumentalism directed at Earth-based ecosystems, that this will also carry into space the notion of overriding all but human interests. So we have cloud seeding, which has been experimented with since the 1940s, and it raises precisely these kinds of questions about instrumentality. It may indeed be possible, I'm a little dubious about it, that by spraying airborne chemicals, forcing rain from the atmosphere, or as the Russians have reportedly been spending millions to make sure it rains before rather than during major events. But as the newspaper headlines looking at these activities asked, should we be playing God and controlling the weather, quite apart from all the questions about the volatility of causing rain and sometimes devastating floods, or the use of potential such techniques in aggressive ways? It's a reality that forcing the clouds to rain in one place means that they don't rain where they should. So it's a nice example of that kind of division in values and ideologies that promote this kind of ongoing directive instrumentality, and then promoting the notion that sustainability can only be protected by protecting both human and non-human needs and interests. And of course, if we follow the latter course, our engagement with celestial domains will focus on how to prevent further disruption of atmospheric processes, how to work with rather than on the spatial and temporal movements of air and water. So in that sense, we would garden the sky not for exploitation, but for inspiration. So I thank you.